Hashem, Daf Lamed Hey Amid Aleph, the Mishnah. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. We are finally back in and discussing finally once again the mitzvah of matzah on Pesach. Elu devarim she'odem yaitze behem yidei chavasim bePesach. These are the things. These are the types of grains, the flour from these kind of grains that one could be yaitze the chayv on Pesach of eating matzah. As Rashi says, mishum chayvis matzah bilel rishon, because of the chayv, the obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach, shehu mechuyev le'echol matzah, because on the first night there's a chiyuv to eat matzah, kidiksiv, like it says, be'erev toichlu matzahs. In the evening you shall eat matzahs. So we see from over here, first of all, that the chiyuv to eat matzahs is only the first night of Pesach. The rest of Pesach, there is no chiyuv min haTorah, there is no obligation min haTorah to eat matzah, but the Vilna Gaon does say there is a mitzvah, kiyum ha-mitzvah. There is a mitzvah that if you eat matzah, for every bite that you take a matzah, you get a mitzvah the rest of Pesach. But the chiyuv ha-mitzvah, the true obligation, that is only the first night of Pesach, because it says be'erev toichlu matzahs, in the evening you shall eat matzahs. So once again, elu devarim, these are the things, these are the grains. These are the grains from whose flour you can make she'adam yaitze behem yidei chavasim bePesach, that a person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. Bechitim, from the flour of wheat, b'sayrim of barley, b'kusmin of spelt, u'b'shipun of rye, u'shibayle shul of oats. A shul is actually a fox, but it's called shibayle shul because the grains of oats have the ears like a fox. V'yaitze, and one is also yaitze if one makes his matzah out of the following: from bidemai, from matzah made from demai. What is demai? Demai is produce that one is buying from an Amma Aretz, from an ignorant person, a person who's an unlearned person. So, in HaTorah, he's a Jew, he has a cheskes kashrus min HaTorah, that of course he's going to tithe, he's going to give all the stuff that he needs to give from his truma before he's allowed to eat it. He's going to give the truma to the Kayan, the Maisa Rishon to the Levi, the Maisa Ani to the poor person, the Maisa Sheni. He's going to give the Maisa Sheni. He's going to take off a piece from Maisa Sheni and eat it in Yerushalayim, or redeem it onto money and bring the money to Yerushalayim. But the Rabbanim were worried. They saw that unfortunately the unlearned people too often were not doing all of the tithing. They were pretty good about doing the tithing for the Kayan to take off Truma. But the other tithings, the Maisa Rishon for the Levi, and then in the years that they needed to, the Maisa Sheni or the Maisa Ani, they weren't doing it to us. The Mai to me is a short for Damai. What is this? We're not sure what its situation is. So midrabanan, rabbinically, we said you cannot eat from produce. You cannot eat from produce that you buy from an ignorant person unless you go ahead and you separate out all the mices that need to be separated. Midrabanan. So, in Kol Zeh, that I just said that, the Mishnah goes and says, V'yotzin, you still can fulfill your obligation of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach, b'demai, with such grains that you bought from the Amoritz, and you did not yet separate out what you were supposed to separate out. It's still under the label demai. And obviously the Gemara is going to ask, how come? Demai midrabani, you're not allowed to eat until you clean it up and you go ahead and separate what you must. The Gemara is going to ask the question. And of course you can fill your obligation from Maisa Rishon, whose Truma was separated. That is, a Levi gets Maisa Rishon. A Levi, in fact, can take his Maisa Rishon, which is that a person has to give 1/10 of what's grown to the Levi, Maisa Rishon. And then the Levi has to give Maisa Mina Maisa. He has to give Trumas Maisa, from his Maisa that he got, from the 10% that he got from somebody, he then has to separate 10% and give that to the Kohen. So we're saying over here, Maisa Rishon that the Levi we got, Shenitla Truma, so that he then proceeded to separate out the Truma from that he has to give from the Maisa Rishon that he received, known as Trumas Maisa, and Umaisa Sheni Behegdish Niftu, and Maisa Sheni and Hegdish, property that was Makadesh, that was concentrated to the base of Migdash, which was redeemed, which you're allowed to do. You're allowed to redeem it onto money, so that the produce or the property itself are now allowed to be used as chulin, and the money needs to be used in either in Yerushalayim as Maisa Sheni, or the money has to be given back to the Bedek Habayis, to the base of Migdash. But that Maisa Sheni and Hegdish that were paida, that were redeemed, are now chulin and can be used for matzah. Kohanim and Kohanim b'chala, with challah, as you know, when a woman bakes a challah, she has to separate out challah, a small piece of the dough, which needs to go to the kohen. Today we burn those with the chametz, but at the time of the Gemara, you would give it to a kohen. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, you would give it to a kohen. Ubit truma, and obviously with truma, because the truma belongs to the kohen. But nobody can fulfill their obligation of eating matzah with tevel. Once again, what was tevel? Grains that were already picked from the ground and were smooth, and mariach was smooth, were clean, were taken out of the shaft, and their ears were piled up. So now, once that's that stage, that level, they be tevel, which means they cannot be eaten unless all of the trumas maisus are separated out from that produce. So obviously tevel is also to eat, and therefore you can't make matzah from its grain, from its flour. Nor from Ma'aser Rishon that the Levi had, that the Levi did not yet separate out the truma, the trumas ma'aser, the truma that he has to give to the kohen. If he didn't separate it out, his Ma'aser Rishon right now is usher. Nor with Ma'aser Sheni or Kodesh property that had not yet been redeemed. If it's not yet redeemed, it's still what do you call it? It has to be either you have to take the Ma'aser Sheni and go to Yerushalayim. You can eat it in Yerushalayim. You can eat the matzah in Yerushalayim, but you can't eat it in Boca Raton. The Hegdish Shalai Nifta, obviously Hegdish that wasn't paid to use, it's also to use. So you can. Now, Chaloi Sataida, regarding the unleavened breads that are brought with the taida, carbon taida, a carbon of thanks, was brought for 4 reasons. A person was sick and got healed. He crossed the midbar, he crossed the sea, or he was in prison and he got freed. He would bring a carbon taida. The Torah Kadosha is mechayim to bring along with it 40 unleavened, non-chametz breads along with it. Why 40? So this way we would have to throw a Suda Saidah and get all the breads eaten up, and this way everybody would join in on the thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So regarding those unleavened breads of a taida, and Rikike Nazir, and the unleavened wafers that are brought by a Nazir again is somebody that says, I will not drink yayin. Stam Nazir is 30 days. I won't drink yayin for 30 days. His hair has to grow long. He can't drink wine after 30 days. He brings a carbon. Part of with that carbon is you have to bring unleavened wafers. That's what the Torah Kadosh says. Thin crackers. Okay, but they're unleavened. So, regarding those two, also la'atzman, if he made it for himself, in other words, he was a Nazir or he needed to bring a taida. And then he decided, Pesach's coming. Let me just use them already for matzah. Any yatzim, he does not fulfill his obligation with them. Also on lemancha b'shuk, but if he made them for business, in other words, he didn't have to bring a carbon taida. He's not a nazir, but he decided, I'll make the unleavened breads that one would have to bring with the taida, and I'll make the wafers, the crackers that one has to bring if he's a nazir. There, I would go ahead and I'm going to go into business and I'll sell it in the shuk. So somebody comes to Yerushalayim and whatever and has to bring the carbon taida, he can come to me and buy the breads. Or somebody's a nazir needs to bring the kabbalah, get to me the wafers. So he really just made it for for business. And then he says, since I have it already, I might as well use it for Pesach. Yaitze behem, he can fulfill his obligation to eat matzah the first night of Pesach with the grains with these unleavened loaves or wafers. So something Gemara. The Gemara is going to get into the 5 grains. Okay, Tana, we learned kusmin spelt min chitin is a type of wheat. Shiboila shul v'shifan min sa'irin, and oats and rye are a type of barley. Fine, good. While we're at it, kusmin gulba. Kusmin spelt in Aramaic is known as gulba. Shifain, the yishra, shifain, which is rye, is known as dishra. Shiboila shul, shiboila tala. Shiboila shul, oats, is known in Aramaic as shiboila tala. Fine. We're now on 35A3. So now, the Mishnah just said that you mekayim your mitzvah of achilas matzah, you do your obligation of achilas matzah on the first night of Pesach with one of the 5 grains that the Mishnah mentioned. Chitin, sa'irin, kusmin, shibayla shoel. So it's up to Gemara. Hani in those 5, yes. Therefore, it means oires v'doichen loy, rice or millet, those types of grains, the flour from such types of grains, you're not mekayim your mitzvah of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. How do I know this? So it's up to Gemara. Reish Lakish said v'chein tana debei Rabbi Shmuel, and also they taught in the yeshiva Rabbi Shmuel. V'chein tana debei Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, they also taught in the yeshiva Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Amakra, the pasuk says, Lo yisaychel alav chametz, you shall not eat chametz with it. You shall not eat chametz with the Pesach offering, which is the reason why we have the Isser chametz from the 7th hour on. Shivas yomim toichel alav matzos. For 7 days you shall eat matzos with it. From this, that the pasuk starts off with chametz and juxtapositions it with, but 7 days you shall eat matzah. We have a comparison between chametz from matzah to chametz. Devarim aboyim lidei chimutz, only things that can become chametz, that can become leaven when left to rise. Then a person could fulfill his obligation to eat matzah. Yatsu elu, therefore, excluded from this are these like rice flour and millet flour, which cannot come to be leavened. According to this man, they do not rise. On the contrary, they only come to be spoiled. When it looks like to you that they're rising, in fact, they're only being spoiled. They're only being spoiled. So, in that case, so once again, from the pasuk, therefore what we just said, that matzos are compared to chametz. Only grains that could become chametz, that could rise, only such grains could be used for matzah. So Reish Lakish goes further. He says, Masnisin, our Mishnah, which clearly seems to say that rice and millet flour cannot be used for matzah, the like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, are not like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. The Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, give me 1 second, I'm about to put my phone on silent. Here we go. Thank you. Masnis the like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Our Mishnah, therefore, that says that rice and millet flour do not rise and are not, therefore, not flour that can be used for matzah to be yaitze yechiv of eating matzah, because do not go like Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Oireis min doganu. Rice is a species of grain. It's a type of grain. And you are liable for chorus if you eat the rice in a leavened form, in a form that is chametz, which means he holds that rice could become chametz. The Tanya, because we learned Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri asks one to eat a food cooked with rice or millet during Pesach, because because such grains are close to leavening, which would seem to mean because those grains leaven quickly. So Frank the Gemara Boilu, Shekarev lahachmitz, when the Brisa says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri states that these grains, iris v'doichin, that Brisa millet, are karev lahachmitz. What does he mean? The kodim umachmitz, that they leaven quickly, or does he mean Dilma karev lahachmitz have? They're close to leavening. Chamutz gomu alay have, but in fact they do not become fully leavened. And if they don't become fully leavened, at best they might be usher, but they're certainly not chayiv chorus. You're not chayiv the death penalty of chorus, of being cut off, just because you ate them on Pesach. Toshma, so the brings a brisa. The Tanya, Ami Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says, Oires min dogenu. Rice is a type of grain. V'chayovin al chimutzai chorus, and you chayiv for chorus if you eat this iris, the rice, in its chametz state, in its leavened state. This price says, Rabbi Yochanan says it clearly, and one does fulfill his obligation on Pesach to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach. And by the way, karomis, which is another kind of grain, is also subject to the challah, that you have to separate from it. It is a grain that when you bake with it, when you make a challah with it, you have to separate challah to give it to the kohen. But what do you see from here? That Yochanan ben Nuri clearly says that rice is a type, that if it rises, it is considered rising to become chametz, and if you eat it, you are chayiv kares. And then he says, therefore, since it is a type of chametz, it is a type of grain that can rise to become chametz to make you chayiv b'kares if you eat it on Pesach. Therefore, it's a type of grain that you could use and you could satisfy your obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach with such a grain. And then he ends with karamis chayeves b'chala. So the Gemara asks, my karamis. So Amar Abaya, shitzanisa. It's shanitza. Very good. Now we know what it is. So says the Gemara, my shitzanisa. What is shitzanisa? Amar Papa shitzanisa the mishtakha bene kalonisa. Shanitza is found growing among the poppies, which means that it's a fennel flower. If you look it up on Google, fennel flower, you'll see what it is. It's a type of flower that grows, and that grew in Iraq and Iran. It still does to this day, and in Northern Europe. Anyways, you see that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, dough made from rice or millet does become chametz. If you eat it, you're chayiv kares, and therefore it's flour. The flour from them could be used to make matzah, and you what do you call it? And you can cover your obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach from this. Okay? And you yotzi yedei chabosim b'Pesach. So now, before we said that again, only grains that are capable of becoming chametz could then be used to be yotzi yedei chabosim b'Pesach, could be used to make the matzah on the first night of Pesach. Amar Rabbi Baruch Hanan Amar Rish Lakish, Isa dough shalisha biyayin v'shemenu devash, that were kneaded with wine, oil, or honey instead of water, otherwise known as we're about to see as matzah ashura, rich man's matzah. And in the question, ein chayavin al chimutzei kares. You're not, in other words, fruit in the terms of the Gemara, fruit juices. Dough that was kneaded with fruit juices, ein chayavin al chimutzei kares. One is not liable for kares upon them rising in the leavened form. And the Gemara explains. Yosef Rav Papa v'Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yeshua Kamed Rav Aidi bar Rovin. Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, was sitting in front of Rav Aidi bar Rovin. V'Yosef Rav Aidi bar Rovin v'kol min nam name. And Rav Aidi bar Rovin was sitting and he was dozing off. So the Talmidim in front of him started talking. Amalei Rav Huna b'Reid Rav Yeshua Rav Papa. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yeshua, said to Rav Papa, my Talmud Reish Lakish. What is the Talmud Reish Lakish that he says? Fruit juices, essentially the dough kneaded with yain shemenu devash. Okay, how come they're exempt from kares in their leavened state. Even if they become a chametz, if they rise, they're still potter from kares. Amalei, so Rabbi said to him, the Hamakra, loy seichel alav chametz, you shall not eat chametz with it. Shivas yamim teichel alav matzahs, 7 days you shall eat matzahs. By the juxtaposition of matzah to chametz, we learn devarim shodim yaitzebehem yedei chavaseh b'matzah. Only those doughs which people can fulfill their obligation to eat matzah on the first night of Pesach, which means that one can bake them in an unleavened form. One is liable to eat kares on eating them in their leavened form. Vaha, with regard to the fruit juices, since a person cannot fulfill his obligation of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach with such a matzah, because lay matzah ashira, because this product made out of fruit juices is called matzah ashira, and the Torah is clear that you have to eat lechem oini, the poor man's bread. Poor man's bread is wheat and water, not wheat and wine, oil, or honey, or from the juices of fruits. And chayovim achimutze kares. You're therefore not chayiv kares. If these things should happen to rise and become leaven, become chametz, you're not chayiv kares, because these things are create, when made with wheat, make matzah ashira, a rich man's matzah, with which you cannot fulfill your chiyuv on the first night of Pesach of the erev toichlu matzahs. On this, in the evening, you shall eat matzah. That's only with lechem oini, only with the poor man's bread. The rest of the Pesach, there's no chiyuv, there's no obligation to eat matzah. There is, if you eat matzah, you're mekayim a kiyum a mitzvah, you get a mitzvah. But if you don't eat matzah, it's not a problem. You don't have to eat matzah the rest of Pesach. The chiyuv, the obligation, is only at the night, and that night is a chiyuv in lechem oini, in poor man's bread. Since it's only that, so therefore chametz and Pesach are tied together because of the pasuk that says lo yisrakel alav chametz. You shall not eat on it chametz. Shivas yomim, 7 days toichel alav matzah. You shall eat with it matzah. You shall eat the matzah with it. So therefore they're together, tied together. The chametz is tied also to matzah, and the matzah is only a chiyuv on the first night of matzah. Only the poor man's bread. So the poor man's bread, yes. The rich man's bread, no. So only the grains of a poor man's bread is chayiv kares if you should eat it in a leavened form. Excluding that is therefore matzah ashir, which is made with fruit juices. Yes, you're usher, but you cannot, if it becomes chametz, you're usher to eat it, but you don't get kares. So when he said, Papa said this to Rav Huna asked him, if one dissolved a grain product into water and then swallowed it on Pesach, so he took a grain, let's say one of the 5 grains, and he put it into water, he dissolved it into water, and then he drank it onto Pesach, and he drank it on Pesach. Im chametzu, if it turned into chametz, it rose in the water, on his kares, he gets kares. The matzu, if what happens, it just turned into a thin matzah. Ein adam yaitzi yedei chavasa b'Pesach. A person cannot fulfill his obligation of be'erev teichel matzah on the evening you shall eat matzah by drinking the matzah out of a cup, because the pasuk says shivas yamim, 7 days toichel olav matzah, you shall eat on it matzah. It's a chiyuv in eating, not consuming, if by drink. So you see, by drinking it, you're not yotze your chiyuv of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. But you are chayiv cards for drinking it. Before you said regarding before that it's all tied to lechem oini, but if it's not lechem oini, it's only the chametz and matzah are tied to lechem oini, but matzah ashura, if it gets leavened, therefore it's true. If it becomes leavened, you're also to eat it. but you're not chayiv kares. But matzah shira, you're not yoytzi yedei chavosei Pesach of matzah. With matzah shira, you cannot be yoytzi yechiv of eating matzah on the first night of Pesach because it's lechem moini. So it's a case with matzah shira. Matzah shira is got nothing. You can't be yoytzi your obligation, the chiv of eating matzah, and yet. And we said, and therefore we said, since it's not tied to the first night, the ikar chiyuv of eating matzah, if it becomes chametz, you're not chayiv kares. Here you see where you cannot be, where if you drink it, it's not, you're not yotzi yechiv of matzah, yet if you drink it and it's chametz, you are chayiv kares. It's not adding up. Zakti Gemara. Ita bahu Rav Eidi bar Oven. In the meantime, Rav Eidi bar Oven woke up, Amaluhu, and he said, let me explain it to you. The Darte Hainu Tamadure Shlokish. The Darte means lads, Kinderlach, kids, you have misunderstood the law. The reason why Reish Lakish says that Matzah Ashura, which he said, Isa Shelusha B'Yayim B'Shemen Devash, though that was needed with wine, oil, and honey, ain't chayiv malachim it's kares. You're not chayiv kares when if it should become. You're not chayiv kares if you consume it while it's in a leavened form when it's chametz. It's because mishum dahave lehu mei peris, because it's liquids that are juices of fruits. They are juices of mei peris, of juices of fruits. And now we're on Amud Beis 35b1. Umei peris. And fruit juice and fruits of juice and juices of fruits cannot cause a bread to rise, cannot cause a bread to become chametz. That's why he says you're not chayiv kares, because he said things that are needed with fruit juices do not become leaven, do not become rising. So number one, this is the reason why that most of us hold that if a bagel is baked with fruit juices, you still have to, you don't have to wash on them. Now, the other sheet is you do have to wash on them, even though we just said things that are done with mei peris, with fruit juices, do not rise. But the halacha is, since a bagel, if it looks like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's a duck. If it looks like a bagel and it tastes like a bagel, it is a bagel. Alts the bagel itself, you wouldn't have to wash. But alts kaveya suda, since you're being kaveya suda, you're saying I'm having a meal with this, and it looks like bread and it tastes like bread. The other sheet is you do have to wash on it. So my Rebbe, actually, Rabbi Belsky, Zechenel Rachav Tarvidas, held like the second way. He said, it's true, it's needed with fruit juices. But since you're kaveya suda, you do establish a meal with it because it looks like a bagel and it tastes like a bagel, so it's a bagel. You have to wash and you have to bench on it. And that's the way most people do, though the Hasidim by Flodge do not. Okay, the other thing over here is, Rashi says, Mei Peris Eina Machmitzin, that fruit juices do not make chametz, you're not chayiv kares. But Rashi says you are chayiv because they are chametz nuksha, shvach, weak chametz. They are inferior quality chametz. They're inferior quality chametz, and you're not allowed to eat them. You're not chayiv kares, as we said over here, but you're not allowed to eat them. Rabbeinu Tam argues and says absolutely not. Fruit juices don't rise, and they're mutter things that are needed and baked with fruit juices on Pesach are allowed to be eaten on Pesach. There's no problem. Now, what happens if you have fruit juices and you added a little bit of water? So where the fruit juices are the majority, there already Rashi says, if there's a little bit of water, it certainly rises and you chayiv kares if you eat it. Rabbeinu Tam says, no, you're not chayiv kares, but I'll grant you that if there's a little bit of water, even though the majority is fruit juices, it is now chametz naksha. It is inferior type of chametz, which is usher to eat. Anyways, that's what's going on with this Gemara. Zok Gemara weiter. Again, 35b1. And one fulfills his obligation if he makes matzah from the grain of demai. Right, the Gemara demai It's not fit for eating. Again, what's the mai? Grains that come from an amaretz, an ignorant person, a person who's unlearned, where Minatayri is perfectly fine. Everybody has a cheskes kasha that he gave all his trumas and maises. He tithed everything. But the Rabbanim were afraid that he was only tithing for the koyin, the truma, but he wasn't giving out all the other trumas and maises, the maises rishon to the Levi, the maises sheni that has to be in Yerushalayim, or the maises ani. So we have dim damai. What is this? And the Rabbanim were geyser that you cannot eat from any of it until you, the purchaser, from this ignorant person, from this unlearned person, you have to go ahead and separate out all the trumas maises. You have to separate all the tithes. So demai, how could you say that demai, something that's still under the label demai, it still was just bought from an amaretz, from an unlearned person, and wasn't separated yet? All the tithing you can still use that to make matzahs, the grains of that, the flour of that to make matzahs, and you can be yotzi yechiv of eating matzahs on the first night of Pesach. Says the Gemara, since the owner who just bought the demai, if he wanted to, could be mafkir, he could renounce ownership on all his properties, which would make him a poor person. And the din is have a oniva oichel demai. And if he was a pauper, a poor person, he's allowed to eat the demai, the gezeris, the rabbanon, the decree from the rabbanon doesn't apply. Since now that's the case, he could theoretically do this, be mafkir all his nechasim, what he could renounce his ownership of all his property and be poor, and then be able to eat the demai. So since there's a shasa kosher, there's a way for it to be kosher, that's enough. Whereas we discussed the other day with Isaac's question, the answer is when there is a law, there's a law. We try not to find exceptions to the law. Where there is a law that if you're an ani, you could eat the mai. And since the matzah on the first night of Pesach is lechem oini, the bread of a poor person, therefore you can go ahead and be yotzis chiyuv. Okay, zok the Gemara. It's not. Machilin esaniyim demai. We are allowed to feed poor people from demai. Vesachsanya demai, and Jewish soldiers that are traveling through, you could absolutely feed them with demai. V'amar Rav Huna says, Tana, we learned in a brayso, b'shama yoimrim, ein machilin esaniyim demai, you're not allowed to feed poor people demai, vesachsanya demai, but the traveling soldiers, the Jewish traveling soldiers, you could. You are allowed to feed them both the ani and the traveling soldiers with demai, and of course our halacha, our mission is following according to Beis Hillel. So the Gemara weiter. And a Levi who has Maiserishin, who he then took off the Trumas. Now this is just one thing to know, that Maiserishin is considered monetary. So in fact, Maiserishin is not holy, it's monetary. You have to give it to the Levi, but after that, anybody can eat from the Levi's Maiser, that even in Yisrael. Obviously, Truma is Kodesh, and only a Kohen could eat it. Okay, so it's different. What Maiserishin is considered monetary, and a monetary obligation, but like anything monetary, of course, once the obligation is fulfilled, anybody can eat it. Truma is considered a kachim, sanctifying, and that only the Truma can, and only the Kohen can eat. But anyways, over here, the Levi did exactly what he was supposed to do. He got Maiserishin, and he then tithed. He took a 10% of his Maiserishin and gave it to the Kohen. So Memele, his Maiserishin is perfectly usable now by anybody. So of course you can make matzah. So practically about Pshita, obviously, since he gave his Trumas Maisers, he gave the Truma from his Maiser, Chulin Have, now it's already Chulin, because now anybody can use it, not just the Levi Yisrael, everybody can use his Maiser. What was the question? Of course you can make the matzah with it. Because here's the situation. If you remember, we learned yesterday that grains that, even though they are detached from the ground, if they're still in their shaft, if they're still in their ears, okay, the ears of wheat, okay, ears of corn, and they've not been smoothed out, miruach, they haven't been smoothed out or piled up. In other words, they haven't been readied, okay, to be brought to the level of tevel, which means that they can now be right when they reach the level of temple. Now they're right to take truma. Until that point, okay, until that point when they're still in their completely unprocessed state, they're not chayiv yet in truma. Okay, they're not chayiv yet in truma. And lo and behold, the Levi goes ahead and is makdim, and he grabs his meiser, his meiserishan, his 10% that he gets from people's grains. He grabbed it from the unprocessed grains, which at that moment in time were not yet obligated in teruma. Says Dr. Mishnah. Where they advanced the separation of the meiserishan ahead of the separation of truma, because while the grains were still in their ears, the grain is not yet obligated in truma. It's not obligated in the sanctification of truma. But along came the Levi and he grabbed his monetary obligation, the monetary obligation of giving him the 10th before it even had a chiyuv of truma. The din is v'nitle imenu trumas maisa, and in his hands, then the maisa was given to the Levi, and then in his hands the trumas maisa was separated from it. In other words, then the Levi said, "Okay, I got my maisa. I have a chiyuv now to give my trumas maisa, my 10% of the 10% that I took." But he never went ahead and gave the client the truma gedola, the 50th% that he normally get, that the client got as truma gedola, its original truma that he was supposed to get upon when the grain was ready, when the grain was processed and became tevel, which became obligated for truma. So again, this Levi grabbed the grain, or the owner of the grain grabbed the grain and gave it to the Levi in an unprocessed state. And the Levi was a good guy, and he gave his 10% after that to the Kohen. But the original truma, that's the truma smaisa, but the original truma that was supposed to come from the original, the 50th percentile that was supposed to come, the 150th that was supposed to come from that truma that was supposed to give it, was never given. Truma gedola was never given. So despite the fact that truma gedola therefore is still in the Levi's portion, in the Meiserishan portion that the Levi has, is still there. The answer is the grain is still allowed to be eaten, once the Levi gives them from this Meiserishan. He gives his obligation of Trumas Meiser. He gives his obligation to give the Truma. He gives his obligation to give the Truma. In other words, his 10% of Trumas Meiser to the Kohen, even though the Truma Gedola was never separated out of it. The grains are now considered chulin, and anybody can use them. Midir Rabavo. I like the way Rabavo learns. The Omer Rabavo, Omer Rab Shimon ben Lakish, Meiser Rishon that goes to the Levi. Shig Dimu Shibolim, that one advanced and took the Meiser Rishon in its unprosperous state when the grains were still in its ears, and gave it to the Levi. Those become potter mitruma gedola. They are completely potter from having to give truma gedola, the 150th to the kohen. Shenema, because the Torah says regarding Meiser Rishon that there is an order to things. Varimoisem mimenu trumas Hashem maisa mina maisa. The pasuk says to the Levi, and a maisa from a meiser, in other words, Trumas Meiser, a Meiser from your Meiser, from the Meiser Rishon that you get, Levi. You have to give a Meiser, you have to give a 10th Trumas Meiser to the Kohen. But it says like this: the pasuk says, "And you shall separate from it Hashem's Teruma, a Meiser from the Meiser. Meiser min a Meiser matilach." I told you, a Meiser from the Meiser, from your Meiser Rishon you shall give. What should you be obligated to give, Levi? You should be obligated to give your Trumas Meiser. Just like you got a 10% Meiser, you have to give 10% of your Meiser, of your Meiser that you received to the Kohen. V'loi Truma Gedola v'Trumas Meiser min a Meiser.